we've been talking about disruption for the past 5 years to the point that I just recently spoke to a journalist and was like, oh, disruption? Like really? We've written so much about disruption and, you know, don't you have anything else to say? It's like, no. So that was a very short interview. But seriously, I think there is something there in this topic which has been drowned out by the fact that we now call everything disruption, right? Disruption has become synonymous for change, right? Disrupting your breakfast habits or, you know, things like that. Also, not everyone who comes and wants to feed on your customers is a disruptor, right? We call it competition, okay? And it's not a new concept, right? Just because someone is in your market and they want a slice of the cake doesn't really mean that they're disruptors. Might feel disruptive to you, right? But you know, we all know competition is good. But the question is there something there that goes beyond that mere competition phenomenon, something that is vaguely new, that is changing? So what I want to talk about is truly game-changing disruption and about something that is at work in those phenomena that tends to be overlooked by the typical narrative and by the typical theories that we use. And I'm going to use the music industry for a couple of reasons. One is the music industry has been sort of a playground for technological innovation forever, since recording began, probably. But I'm not going to talk about the music side, the artistry side as such. And there's lots of disruptions there that I could be talking about, like, you know, multi-track recording and what the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper and how that enabled truly new things to do. And there's amazing stories there. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the very familiar story about the CD and MP3, right? So that's the second reason why this is a good thing to talk about, because we all know what happened, or do we? Right? So that's the idea. So typically, disruption is a new technology coming into a market and displacing the incumbent technology and therefore also leading to widespread failure. So this is Tower Records. It's an amazing story. There's a good movie out there now. It's called All Things Must Pass. I can recommend it. It's not so much about how MP3 came to disrupt it, but it's a great business case study. It's also a case study about how, you know, something small and passionate grew into a multi-million, billion-dollar business, and sort of with the loss of the passion and sort of the corporate nature of business leading to all sorts of questionable decisions. So it's a great example in and by itself. But I want to look at what happened when, you know, one format sort of overrid another in that industry. So this is one of those typical charts, and what you can see here is the release of MP3 in 1995, Napster 4 years later, 1999, and it was only with us for 2 years. It was shut down in 2001. Shortly after, we have iTunes launch and Tower Record going bankrupt officially in the US in, I think, 2005 or thereabouts. Now, this chart looks quite encouraging because what you can see here is yellow is the cassette, green is the LP, red is the CD, and then anything purple is digital. The problem with this chart is digital did not quite make up for the turnover and the money that the music industry was able to reap from their sales, okay? So there's something dramatic there. There are voices in the industry who say it was never sustainable that the industry could sell CDs for $18 that cost them pennies to produce, right? So there was something there that was quite unsustainable about that peak. But what you can see there is a true disruption that happened in economic terms. Now, in order to explain this, we have certain theories, and I'm going to talk about one at the moment. I'm going to ask 4 questions. The first one is, what makes technologies disruptive? What is disruption? Can we even nail that down and distinguish it from other change? Why is disruptive innovation widely dismissed initially? And we think back when the MP3 came along, it wasn't quite the instant success, and neither was the iPod or the iPhone, for that matter. So we tend to dismiss new things initially. A lot of people do, and I want to show and explain why this is quite natural and understandable. But also in hindsight, things look quite inevitable, right? So we look back and say, oh my God, how could anyone put up with buying CDs and look at the prices and cumbersome, and it's only like 15 songs on a CD, and look at my iPod, it's got like a gazillion songs. So why is it that what makes so much sense in hindsight initially doesn't? So that's the phenomenon that I want to talk about. So if we look at the standard theory, it's Christensens' disruptive innovation theory. And it's a good theory because it allows us to pinpoint a couple of things. One is, as businesses, we shouldn't dismiss things that happen in our industry initially. And also, we shouldn't just listen to our existing customers. But it also has, by its very nature, certain things that it can't see. Now, I'll give you a quick rundown, so pay close attention. This is your 2-minute chance to get your head around what Christensen is saying. So first of all, he says, there's a mainstream market and people have certain needs. Those needs will increase over time as we get more sophisticated and bored with the things that we already have. So there's a sort of a linear increase. What the incumbent does is, through a series of sustaining innovations, they're going to innovate on the basis of what the market is and what they understand and what their customers' needs are. Okay? What happens when the disruption unfolds is that someone enters from the bottom. There's some fringes in the market, some customer needs. There could be different attributes of the product, but there is something that isn't addressed by the mainstream competitors, by the incumbent, and that allows the new entrant who comes in with a new technology that is simpler, cheaper, but not really competitive when it comes to the mainstream needs, but it allows them to grow. And what will happen is that the fringe market allows the new entrant to grow, and they will then, and that's what we call the disruptive innovation, make its way into the territory of the incumbent. And because they're cheaper, they offer good enough utility and performance, people will switch. And this is usually where the incumbent goes out of business. Okay, so that's what the theory says. And what we call the innovator's dilemma is that by listening to their customers, the incumbent tends to overshoot. They tend to produce something that really overfulfills what most people need. And that allows the disruptor to then come in and grab the main market. Okay? So one thing with this story that doesn't quite add up if we look at many of the cases that we see out there is that it tends to assume that there's a linear sense of what performance is. If we think about the MP3, okay, it is still inferior to the CD in terms of sound quality. It always has been, but it doesn't seem to matter anymore, right? So somehow something is shifting there that you cannot actually grasp with a picture like that, because it is not like, it has improved and therefore is now tackling the utility needs of the mainstream customers. What has changed is what counts as utility, what we understand performance to be, what the product is. There's a much bigger shift that is going on than a simple linear improvement story, right? That's very hard to grasp with this kind of theory. So I want to say these are Christensen's answers to those questions. First of all, what makes them disruptive? Because they offer good enough quality, but they're much cheaper. Right? So they enter from the bottom. That's the main story here. And that was an innovation. And that is certainly something that we see. And therefore, it has been quite a useful theory to open our eyes that competition can happen from below, right? From products that are initially vastly inferior, and we mustn't dismiss those opportunities. Disruption is defined fairly and squarely as the incumbent failing. So that has been criticized as well. Now, why do we initially dismiss it, or the incumbent for that matter? Because they're too focused on their existing customers. But according to this theory, had the incumbent paid attention, were they across how disruption works, had they read Christensen's theory probably, had they understood the market better, they would have been able to see what was coming, right? So this theory tends to lay a lot of blame on the incumbents, right? Their cognitive frame, something in their head, something in their culture. Somehow they miss the point, right? They're asleep at the wheel. So this theory opens the field for laying blame on the people at Kodak, on the music industry executives. What I want to say is that that's a tad unfair, because the phenomenon that I want to outline is makes it a little bit more even and a little bit more balanced. So as I said, look at the MP3. sound is still inferior technically, but it doesn't seem to matter. So what has changed then? Let me retell the story, okay? And I'm going to draw, I could use various philosophical devices, but I'm going to draw on a theory that is quite well established in different fields, and that is Kuhn's scientific revolutions and the notion of paradigm shift. Now this is where I expect a groan because, you know, here's this professor trying to explain one overused term with another overused term, right? Paradigm, oh my God, right? So that doesn't help. But the notion of paradigm, if understood correctly, it's quite a powerful one. Paradigm is not something that you can be fully conscious of or that we can just go and change or that we can spell out. Paradigm is a little bit like the fish and the water. It is two things mainly. Firstly, it's all the things that we take for granted in the way in which the industry works. Okay? It's who we are, the job titles we have, the products we produce, the supply chains, how we sell to customers, what customers are, what the product is, what is quality about the product, anything we understand. Basically, the whole of the industry and how it works. And that shapes the way in which we collectively understand the industry. So that shapes our outlook on the world. Not individually, it's not in my head, it's in our collective understanding of what's going on. Okay? So that is basically what a paradigm is. And what I want to say is during those foundational disruptive innovations and those shifts, the paradigm shifts, and when that paradigm shift and that understanding shifts, our outlook on the past changes. Okay? So let's have a look. Back in the day, the music industry was organized around the record, around high fidelity. People used to go and buy stereos, and a lot of pride went into getting a good one because you wanted to create that perfect sound in your living room. I've just been part of that generation. There was furniture, right, to display your record collection in the living room. And it had a place in most people's teenage rooms for me at the time, but my parents had their records. For them it was vinyl and then CD, and the industry made a lot of money on that shift as well, right? But that used to be what the industry was like, and everything else tied in with this. Producing records, selling records, buying records, going, listening to records, and things like that. Then there was the cassette, recording music, but it was basically, you would go and you would have music, you would own music. That's what we would do in order to be able to listen to music. And you know, there's a great book here, I can recommend this as well, Perfecting Sound Forever. That was all about perfecting the sound, right? And this is certainly quite fitting with Christensens' theory. The super audio CD, anyone remember that? That was the attempt of the music industry to counter the MP3, but this is clearly overshooting. No one wanted this, no one needed this because it was even more expensive than the CD, and yes, technically had better sound, but it seemed to matter less and less. Now, when Napster happened, it happened at the fringes, and it wasn't relevant to the industry. It wasn't competing. It didn't even have a product. It was just a phenomenon that from within the industry was clearly stealing, was piracy, okay? But for those people who got engaged with Napster, it wasn't nothing like that. There was a new world of possibilities. All of a sudden, you could discover music that there was no way to discover previously on the hard disks of other people somewhere in the world. But magnificent access to music on a never-seen-before scale, and things that you could do that you could never do before. So that allowed people to do new things, right? New things in the world, very much at the fringe, right? In hacker culture, driven by a freedom of information ethos, and all of these kind of things that went hand in hand with this. So from within the Napster community, the narrative and the outlook on the world was much different to what it was from when looked at this from within the mainstream, okay? First of all, it didn't make sense, and it was something to be initially dismissed and then certainly to be fought. And those practices then clash, right? They cross-pollinate, but they also clash. So one thing is, we all of a sudden had this equipment where you could sort of hook up your iPod to your car radio. And there's many instances and many, it was coincided with the advent of the internet. So a lot of that documentary is still preserved online. You know, it was inferior to the CD. It was cumbersome. You needed a computer, right? Ella has a nice story about her being gifted an iPod at the time when everyone had Discman, right? So what do you need this thing for, right? Get a Discman already. So things weren't quite normal. They weren't quite acceptable. They weren't quite mainstream yet. But then gradually things become mainstream. More and more people join the phenomenon. The iPod takes it into pop culture, and things slowly emerge from there, to the point where today it's absolutely normal, right? Music is consumed via Spotify, on your phones, any of these things. So the CD now looks, slightly weird on that new understanding. So what I want to say, it's important to understand that there's a clash in paradigm afoot here. One paradigm stresses possession, ownership, right? We're recording, we're buying, we're selling music. Music is a property. It's owned by the music industry, and it is sold to us. So anything that wants to get rid of that is thievery, piracy. But the other paradigm is one that is based on access, instant gratification, sharing, music as a service. So we've certainly moved to the new paradigm, okay? And now we can ask ourselves, what does that mean in terms of understanding one paradigm on the background of the other? So what has happened is what we call a Gestalt shift. It's much like in this picture, right? Depending on what you take as the background, you see different things, yeah? So we've gone from one paradigm to another. The new paradigm is now normal, it's dominant, and it renders the other paradigm in a new light, to the point where a lot of those practices still exist, okay? You can still get a vinyl. It's essentially being cool now. It's like a sort of a boutique coffee shop. You can go in San Francisco, you can go and have your record produced, okay? But it has a new narrative. It's no longer what one does, it's something special. So the old normal is now something special. It still exists. They seldom completely override each other, those paradigms, but they certainly make the world show up in a new light. So the anatomy of a disruptive change is a path-breaking change. It changes what counts as the product, what is important about the product, what is performance, what is utility, what is quality. And on the new understanding, the CD looks vastly inferior because it's not portable, limited access, only limited songs, it's expensive, all of the kind of things that we want to do with music today, CD can't do. It isn't that MP3 has gotten better, it is that we have completely transformed our understanding of the industry collectively by our doing things differently and therefore seeing the world differently. And that's what we call a paradigm. So a shift in understanding that underpins the shift in practice. So what Christensen sees with his theory is the tip of the iceberg. There's something behind it, right? The effect is there, but without understanding of the wider world of the consumers, for example, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly why those changes happen. And that leaves us with a final conclusion about the wisdom of hindsight and the limits of foresight. If we're looking from today to the CD, the shift in paradigm makes complete sense because we're now in the new paradigm. At the time, it didn't really make that much sense. I'll give you a nice quote which I just found 2 days ago in this magnificent music series, Soundbreaking, which is a TV series which came out in 2016. It's really recommendable. I have the quote there in a minute. This is Suzanne Vega, okay? Famously, her song, Tom's Diner, was used by Karl-Heinz Brandenburg to improve the MP3 algorithm in 1993 to 95. So nitty-gritty work to get this algorithm right. And the vocals in her song basically contributed to that. So she was approached and actually presented with a certificate by Karl-Heinz Brandenburg for her role in creating MP3. Right? And there she is saying, there was this guy talking to me about listening to music on my phone, and I was like, I don't need that. No one needs that. That makes no sense to me. Right? And so she admits she didn't see it coming, and many people didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming, and you're not forced to think about it because you're just in the middle of doing it gradually. Right? So disruption is also not something that happens bam, it happens slowly, creeps up on us, and then in hindsight, it's like, oh my God, what just happened? Because no one wants to buy our products because everyone else has moved on. And here's Mobi, a great comment as well. Our kids, our grandkids will literally be baffled by the idea that anyone would ever own music. Right? Why? Because you can just have it. It's just there. Spotify, Pandora, things like that. So we've moved to a new normal on which the old normal looks completely, outdated, pretty much. And we call that progress. Okay? So, in essence, what makes technologies disruptive? Well, hindsight, really, because if we want to focus on just MP3 and how it disrupted the CD, it's a very limited story because there's so many other things. Napster, the iPod, and all of the kind of things that happened and that we collectively made happen. So that's very hard to say it was one technology that brought about that disruption. And what is disruption? A fundamental path-breaking shift in the industry paradigm. And I want to caution to dismiss this and say, oh yeah, this is this grand story about the whole industry was transformed. I think the shifts that are happening on a much smaller scale, reasonably more often, are of a similar nature. They can happen in a part of an industry, but they're certainly not as often as we nowadays read about disruption. And then why is it widely dismissed initially? Because frankly, it doesn't make sense. It's not useful initially, and it's not a possibility for most people in their daily lives. Some people at the fringes can see it, and it sort of creeps up on us slowly. But in hindsight, clearly, it makes sense because from within the new paradigm, a shift from the old to the new is pretty much an inevitability. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.